I'm Joseph Roscigno, talking about my book, Conducting Opera, where Theater Meets Music. What you just heard was a short excerpt from a Beethoven sonata called Der Sturm, the Storm. Now, composers love to write storms. Conductors like to conduct storms. Hopefully, audiences like to hear storms. And if there are storms in piano music and in symphonic music, you can imagine the potential for storms in opera. And that's what I'd like to talk about in this video, storms in operas. Now, the first thing a conductor has to know is that something is a storm. Now, some operas, the storm is clearly marked storm. But the overture to Mozart's opera Idomeneo portrays a storm, even though it's just marked as an overture. Why do I say that? There is a storm at sea that swamps Idomeneo and his boat and crew on their way back from the Trojan Wars to Greece. It is described by the character Ilya right at the beginning of the opera. And the overture, therefore, logically depicts this storm. So what does this mean for conductors? Well, first of all, probably a tempo a little faster than one would take if the overture were not considered a storm. Secondly, a greater dynamic range in the crescendi and diminuendi. So instead of this, it's nice, but not very stormy. But if I do it like this, it's much more stormy. And you feel the waves. Now, this particular storm was not mentioned in my book, but the next 5 storms are discussed. 2 by Verdi, 2 by Wagner, and 1 by Rossini. The 2 Verdi storms I'd like to talk about are in the last act of his opera, Rigoletto, and in the opening of his opera, Otello. Now, in Rigoletto, the storm happens in the last act, and it is quite a violent storm. Why do I say that? Because the character Spada Fucile, just before, tells the Duke, La tempesta è vicina. And tempesta is more than just rain and thunder. It is a tempest. It's just like our word tempest. It's like a hurricane on land. So for a conductor, really distinguish between what is piano and what is forte. The other suggestion, there is a scale in it. Often you'll hear that scale, and it's repeated a few times, played by violins, first violins, in one long bow, legato. If you have a good orchestra, and most of the orchestras, professional orchestras now are good, ask them to play that separate. So each note is a quick stroke, a separate stroke. It will give it much more excitement and more to the point. It will show the kind of driving wind and rain of the storm. Now, Otello begins with a storm. And composers, when they do give metronomic indications, you'll see a number equaling a certain value note. in this case 76 to the half note. This not only gives us the speed at which the composer thought the piece should go, but also the phrasing. In other words, he gives it to the half note, which would indicate that the conductor should conduct in 2. However, I have found that it is much more exciting if I begin the first part of this storm conducting in 4. And I have it on very good authority that Arturo Toscanini conducted it in 4. In addition, remember that Toscanini stopped conducting briefly to play second cello in the orchestra at Scala for the premiere of this opera. And in the last 8 years or so of Verdi's life, spoke with him often. So, and the difference is in 4, which now is 152 to the quarter note, which is quite a fast tempo. It's the difference between 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 1, 2, which does phrase it differently and gives a lot more drive to the chorus and to the orchestra. Now, it doesn't mean that all of this stays in 4. There is a place where I suggest that the conductor beat in 2, and it's here. One other suggestion for conductors. It's the chorus at exactly this point. In the vast majority of the cases, you'll hear them phrase it like this: Dio fulgor della bufera, Dio sorriso della duna. Well, it is a prayer to God, but it's not that kind of a prayer. It's a desperate prayer. It's a cry to God in the same mood as the last part of the Verdi Requiem. So there's also a comma after the word Dio. So my suggestion is put the O on the second quarter instead of on the third quarter of that bar. So it becomes, instead of Dio fulgor della bufera, Dio sorriso della duna. Now, it's possible that in some piano vocal scores, they leave out the comma. But in the orchestral score, there is that comma, and it gives it a desperation and an excitement that is missing when it's phrased in the other manner. Wagner also wrote some wonderful storms. The opening of his opera, Der Fliegende Holländer, The Flying Dutchman, begins with this, after the overture, begins with a storm at sea that is buffeting the ship of Dalent and the Norwegian sailors. Straightforward. Just don't go too terribly slow. It's marked Allegro con brio, and by the way, he gives 72 to the half note, which this is the only opera after The Flying Dutchman he gave no more metronomic markings. So he kind of suggests this tempo is what he wanted. Also, accent that fourth quarter, that offbeat, which sounds like waves hitting the ship. Also, exaggerate the crescendi and diminuendi in the later chromatic scales. By exaggerate, I'm not implying to go to a dynamic so loud that the tone becomes vulgar. No, don't start mezzo forte as indicated. Start piano. So you have a wider dynamic range within the same amount of time. The opera of Wagner, Die Walküre, begins with a storm. Now, this is the second opera in his 4-opera Ring cycle. And it's not just a violent storm that we're thrust into like we were the beginning of The Dutchman. No, he builds this storm in levels, somewhat like the way he built the River Rhine in the first opera of the Ring cycle, Das Rheingold, the Rheingold. Their intervals become arpeggios, become faster arpeggios. Finally, a melody emerges, and we have the river. Here, we start with this motive. And that builds. And finally, we have the motive chasing itself. And at this point, instead of just bringing timpani in for thunder, he introduces the motive of the god Donner, the god of thunder. We heard him sing the motive and the orchestra play it towards the end of the previous opera of the cycle, the first opera of the cycle, Das Rheingold. And it's this. That's his motive. So it sounds like this. Okay. Then the motive, like this one, gets closer and closer together. And finally, a chromatic scale and an explosion in not one, but 2 timpanis, 2 antiphonal timpanis in the orchestra. My suggestion to the conductor is this. Number 1, don't take a tempo that is too stodgy. It is a storm, so I suggest not to take something like this. That's not very stormy. So closer to this. And when the Donner motive comes in, ask the Wagner tubas to play the upbeat very crisply, very staccato, and not to throw it away. If anything, give it a little bit more emphasis. Most of us who went to conservatory, music school, were taught not to emphasize upbeats, that these upbeats are not accented. The accent should fall on the downbeat. But that really makes little sense. Downbeats are accented by the very nature of the rhythm. So don't throw that little pickup away. So it shouldn't be, but the last storm I'd like to talk about is the storm in Rossini's opera, The Barber of Seville. Now, when I was a child and was first taken to operas, I would hear timpani, sometimes bass drum, occasionally even cymbals added to this storm. Then, when I began conducting the opera myself in the beginning of my career, sometimes when they started having the ability to play offstage actual sounds of thunder, actual sounds of rain. They would play that to kind of highlight this storm. I think that's a mistake. It's not marked tempesta, it's marked temporale. It's a storm, but it's hardly a gale. Secondly, he does not put any of these instruments, bass drum or cymbal, into the score. Now, he did discuss at one time the idea of having maybe some instruments off stage making effects, but he didn't put that into the score. And there is bass drum and sistro, which is like a triangle, and cymbal in the score. This bass drum and cymbal appear in the final chorus of the opera. So he certainly could have put it into the storm. No, I really think this storm is a tempest in a teacup as opposed to a tempest in a teapot. Very small, very delicate, and very funny in that way. Almost think of it as a storm with little Meissen figurines running around. And then when we get to the part marked tuono, thunder, instead of forte, keep it piano. Keep it light. Save the forte, and only a forte, a Rossini forte, when the trumpet enters. One final little thing, if any of you have access to the latest critical edition of this opera, the word tuono over this motive is then written, or now written in the latest edition, tuono with an R. That just means they used an archaic form of the word a form used probably in the 17th, early 18th century for tuono, because that's when the opera is set. It's set in around 1750. Well, I believe I see the clouds breaking. Well, storm's over.